As you can tell, Bible reading's a bit different today, but please follow along. Thank you.
No worries. We are reading from Acts chapter 10, verses 1 to 43. So I'll give you a moment just to find that in your Bibles or follow along on the screen, or just enjoy the creative narration of the scripture reading today. Acts 10, 1 to 43. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day, at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said,
Cornelius?
Cornelius stared at him in fear.
"What is it, Lord?"
he asked. The angel answered,
Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now, send men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea.
When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up to the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its 4 corners. It contained all kinds of 4-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him,
Get up, Peter. Kill and eat.
Surely not, Lord.
Peter replied.
I have never eaten anything impure or unclean.
The voice spoke to him a second time.
Do not call anything impure that God has made clean.
This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. While Peter was wondering about the vision, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. They called out, asking if Simon, who was known as Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him,
Simon, 3 men are looking for you. So get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them.
Peter went down and said to the men,
I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come?
The men replied,
"We have come from Cornelius the centurion. He is a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to ask you to come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say."
Then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guests. The next day, Peter started out with them, and some of the believers from Joppa went along. The following day, he arrived in Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet in reverence. But Peter made him get up.
Stand up.
He said,
I am only a man myself.
While talking with him, Peter went inside and found a large gathering of people. He said to them,
You are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without raising any objection. May I ask why you sent me?
Cornelius answered,
3 days ago, I was in my house praying at this hour, at 3 p.m. Suddenly, a man in shining clothes stood before me and said, Cornelius, God has heard your prayer and remembered your gifts to the poor. Send to Joppa for Simon, who is called Peter. He is a guest in the home of Simon the tanner, who lives by the sea. So I sent for you immediately, and it was good for you to come. Now we are all here in the presence of God to listen to everything the Lord has commanded you to tell us."
Then Peter began to speak.
I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. You know the message God sent to the people of Israel, announcing the good news of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. You know what has happened throughout the province of Judea, beginning in Galilee after the baptism that John preached, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and how he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him. We are witnesses of everything he did in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They killed him by hanging him on a cross, but God raised him from the dead on the third day and caused him to be seen. He was not seen by all the people, but by witnesses whom God had already chosen, by us who ate and drank with him after he arose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one whom God appointed as judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him, that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name.
They did a very good job. I'd been nervous doing that if I was them. But it's a story that really requires being told and listened to like that, I think. Okay, now apparently you might have got an electronic copy of the sermon outline for today. And if you're getting a bit lost, that's the thing to follow as we go along. Otherwise, if you've got Acts 10 out, it's handy to be able to reference it while we go through what we're looking at here. Okay. Well, I read the 90-year history of the Church Missionary Society with Aboriginal people in Arnhem Land. And I didn't realise that in 1903, the Eastern and African Cold Storage Company was buying up vast tracts of land in Northern Australia and seeking to set up a huge pastoral empire around the Roper River. And the company was determined that it was going to work, and they were prepared to exterminate the Aboriginal people there to achieve that. I had mistakenly grown up in my education thinking that Tasmania was the only place that had this happen for the Aboriginal people. But no, it happened much further abroad, right up to the northern tip. So here's the speech, part of a speech, by the Bishop of North Queensland at the Church Missionary Conference in Melbourne in Collins Street in 1906. This is 120 years ago to the year. He says, "We have an airy way of speaking about Australia being a white man's country. But Australia, first of all, was a black man's country, and I've never heard that a black man invited us to take his property away from him. A previous conference speaker has said the British were put by God in Australia to preach the gospel to the heathen. I've never heard a more complete condemnation of the stewardship of the Australian people. We've developed the country, we've civilised it, but we have certainly done very little to preach the gospel to the people who have been dispossessed. The blacks have been shot, poisoned, now they're left to kill themselves with white vices. But very few have received at our hands either justice or consideration." Now, when I hear that speech, I think, how is it that somebody can so disentangle themselves from their culture of the day to be able to have and see with razor-sharp clarity what, somewhat prophetically, what the majority of us only realised and felt remorse about 100 years ago. 100 years later. Prejudice doesn't really bother you until it starts to affect the people that you're close to. Clearly, when Christians in Melbourne heard about what was happening in Northern Australia, they initiated the Roper River Mission Station. And there's no doubt its primary purpose was to stop the Aboriginal people there from falling off the face of the world. Prejudice is really ugly and it's brutal with people. It's a rejection that takes place, opportunities are withdrawn, relationships are severed, and the criteria is simply this for counselling. It's either your ideology, your behaviour, your race, your colour, your appearance, your sex, your nationality, your job, the school you went to. It just goes on. It's not just historical, is it? Because we're living in an age now where society is getting more and more splintered into smaller and smaller groups of people who will only talk and relate to the people who think and talk exactly like them. And those circles are getting tighter and tighter. We've got a radical left, but now we've got an extreme right as well, and we've got all these different shades in between, and they've stopped talking to each other. So it just gets worse and worse. We have little time or little ability to listen, hear, or treat someone with dignity. And for the Christian, we add to that being able to see people in the image of God. So why do some groups of people shut the door on others? Well, the Bible's answer to that is it's just a manifestation of damaged people living in this world. And they come up against a holy God, and they look at that God and they think, well, there's no way I can be like that. So if I can't find approval with a pure, holy God, then I'm going to find my own sort of form of approval. And the easiest way to do that is to try and lift yourself up above other people and push them down in the process. Keep others down, you'll rise higher. Few groups were more guilty of this than the first century Palestinian Jews in this story. Because look at Peter's comment in chapter 10, verse 28. He says, "You're well aware that it's against our law for a Jew to associate with a Gentile or visit him." So their mistake was that they so relished the fact that they were called the chosen people of God that they ignored their responsibility to be a blessing to the nations around them. What began as a concern to mirror God's holiness morphed into developing creative ways to keep the riffraff at an arm's length. Jews were not allowed to have contact with Gentiles. The common teaching of the time was that God created the Gentiles to fuel the fires of hell. Now, you have to remember, nearly every one of us here probably is a Gentile. So this is how we were seen in the first century. Cornelius is not just any old Gentile. He happens to be a leader of the occupying forces. And that force, the Roman Empire, brutally subjugated the Jews to their Roman rule. Here's the original charter to the Jews in Genesis 12. Promise to Abraham, I'll make you into a great nation, I'll bless you, and all the peoples of earth will be blessed through you. How did the Jews stray from this great charter, this great vision of what they were there for? Well, they twisted a doctrine of grace into a doctrine of favoritism. This is the culture in which Peter was raised as a Jew. And it resonates uncomfortably with where our culture seems to be going at the moment in Australia. And yet, what is the mission mandate given to the disciples by Jesus in Matthew 28 and Acts 1? It's go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them and teaching them everything that I've commanded you. Now, I want you to just try and understand the depth of this. Can you imagine the huge hurdle here? Here's the great news of Jesus Christ, and we've got to get it to the ends of the earth, but the Jews won't mix with Gentiles, so how in the world is it going to happen? It's the crunch point. And unless you have Acts chapter 10 happening, it can't get there, humanly speaking. The gospel would have stalled in Jerusalem. And that means that the mission mandate to preach to people like you and I would never have happened. We wouldn't be here except for what happened in Acts 10. It's a recurring problem for Christians who engage in authentic mission. I see church culture a little bit better through the eyes of my not yet Christian friends who I bring to church. I took one person and they said at the end of the service, well, they were offended, actually, by the way the leader introduced himself and what he said to visitors. So this person said to me, you know, he said, it's great that you're here exploring the Christian faith today. He goes, that's a presumption. I'm not here because of that. I'm here because you invited me to church and I trust you. Well, that's an interesting insight, isn't it? St. Bart's Norwood run a fantastic mission in the CBD out of Mary Mag's Church on Moore Street. It's around the corner from the Engage office in the southeast corner of the city. And what they attempt to do is to serve a sit-down meal every Saturday night for the homeless, where they get served on a table and they have, several course meal. Some Christians in Engage have got involved in that. And they cover off, I think, on, is it about once a quarter mil that they basically people turn up to do that. So, but they haven't got enough people to do it. But the Christians just have to be there, serve the meals and befriend people and have conversation. Someone else does all the cooking. So, if you're curious, you think this might be a good way for you to cross a few boundaries, then contact the Engage office and we can fill you in on the dates that we're supposed to be there. Matt Perman, in his book, What's Best Next, he said, this is how we can get to the position of where the Jews were in the first century. He says, sometimes Christians have reduced morality to an avoidance ethic. Instead of seeing the Christian life as being proactive and abundant in doing good, it essentially shrinks to seeing it as avoiding the bad. It shrinks to just avoiding the bad and seeing it that way. Discipleship becomes the art of disinfecting Christians rather than sending them out in for any real engagement in the world. Frankly, who gets excited about a life lived holed up in a Christian bunker allegedly safe from the rest of the world? Is that your picture of how you're living as a Christian in the world? That's not God's. Acts 10 is about solving that dilemma. So we get two unsettling visions in Acts 10. First one in verses 1 to 8 is Cornelius' vision. He's a Gentile. The other vision is to a Jew, which is Peter, which we'll come to in a minute. But if you have a look again at verses 1 to 8, I've already said Cornelius is a centurion, which means that he's at least looking after 100 soldiers. He's a devout, God-fearing man. We learn here in verses 1 to 8, along with the rest of his family, he gives generously to those in need. He prays to God regularly. And clearly God has noted all this. And in verse 4, as a sign of his sincere heart's search for God, God now sees that and he wants to send him an angel to tell him how he can find an evangelist to tell him about Jesus. Now, here's an interesting question. If you look at that story carefully, don't you think to yourself, why didn't the angel preach to him the gospel of Jesus then and there? Why does the angel send him on a great search 51 kilometres away to find a Jew who will explain to him who Jesus is? So, now while Cornelius sends off his search party, Peter is 51 kilometres away and he's on a rooftop praying. And if you look at verses 9 to 33, you can see he's hungry. God dishes up a vision that's calculated to disgust him. It involves dropping a sheet, a large sheet down from heaven with every type of animal that a good Jew would never touch with a barge pole. And Peter protests when God tells him to kill and eat the things in the sheep. Verse 14, surely not, Lord, I have never eaten anything impure or unclean. None of those things have touched my lips throughout my whole life. A friend of mine went on a mission trip to the Philippines, and he said it was a life-changing experience, but there was also an event that traumatized him. He said that everywhere he went, there were street vendors selling raw eggs, and they were expensive. And often, to honour a guest who was with them, the Filipino people would chip in and buy one of these eggs and then give it to him to eat in their presence. They were expensive because they were called balut. And Rose knows what this is, who's in your congregation here. So if you want more details after the service, you can ask her. But it's a delicacy from the Philippines made from incubated duck eggs. And in fact, the closer that the duck gets to hatching, the more expensive the egg becomes. And he said the first one that he ate almost made him throw up as he crunched into the bones of the near hatchling in his mouth. Now, I think that's about the closest I can get to how Peter must have felt with that vision where God is telling him to eat what is putrid for him. While Peter's trying to make sense of the vision, Cornelius arrives with his search party at the door. And verse 20, the angel anticipates Peter's hesitation. He says, no, go down. Verse 23, he invites them into his home as guests. That is remarkable in itself, for a Jew to do that with a Gentile. The next day they put out for a full day's travel, and they eventually get to Cornelius' house the following day. And, what you're thinking at this point is, what is going to happen when the world of Cornelius and the world of Peter collide and meet? And the following day in Caesarea, Cornelius is expecting him with his gathered welcoming party, and I imagine he's somewhat nervous, shifting from foot to foot. Here comes Peter. And immediately, when he sees Peter, he bows down before him. And as soon as Peter crosses that doorway and comes to him, he rebukes him. He says, "Get up, I'm only a man." And you think, well, this is going well, this little encounter. And that's because Cornelius may be a God-fearer, but he has a very distorted and elevated view of some parts of humanity, to the point where for Peter says, "You're treating me like I'm God." And that view of humanity must be transformed. But ironically, so will Peter's in this story. After hearing the story of Cornelius' vision, Peter learns the opposite lesson to Cornelius. He learns not to reject some people as if they're a dog. Here are two views of humanity, and they both need transformation. One is to treat people like they're a god, the other is to treat them like they're a dog. You can't elevate humanity to a god like Sadist. You can't denigrate humanity to a dog-like one. And as fallen creatures, we have an incredible propensity to push to those two boundaries. And these views of humanity are colliding constantly in our world, aren't they? Inside families, on our streets in protest, our workplaces, on our social media feeds, so much grief, prejudice, cancelling, injustice, and God must radically transform the way that these two men relate to each other. The messenger, the hearer. Here's the irony. If you're praying for somebody to become a Christian and you're trying to share your faith with them, you want to see an amazing change in them. You're trying to reach them. But the ironic thing is that in doing that, God may actually be changing you. So, what is it that Peter realizes when he actually meets Cornelius. Verses 34 to 48, Peter joins the dots together. This vision of unclean animals, God's command not to call anything impure that he's made clean, the Gentiles on his doorstep, Cornelius recounting his compelling vision to Peter, and Peter can now see that God has been at work in Cornelius long before he got there. He's now ready for God to realign the pegs in the ground, to understand the difference between what's culture for him as a Jew and what Jesus' good news has transformed for him. In verse 34, he says, I now realize. He didn't realize before, but now he does get it. Now, this is interesting to me because this is what discipleship is all about. When you follow Jesus, you're constantly saying throughout your life, I didn't realize, now I do understand. I do fully realize. You know, just because you know the gospel doesn't mean you have all the wisdom and the insight into every part of it. So what is it that Peter realizes? He realizes that God does not show favoritism, but accepts people from every nation who fear him and do what is right. That's Peter's blind spot. Even after 3 years with Jesus. You know that scene towards the end of Jesus' life when he walks into the temple the week before he's taken to the cross, and he clears out the temple money changers. Why did he do that? Well, because the temple changers, the people who were changing your money over and all that sort of thing, they'd set up in the court of the Gentiles. The court of the Gentiles was the only place where a Gentile could go in God's temple to connect with God. And Jesus was livid that they'd actually filled it like a bazaar. Peter didn't really join those dots together at the time. But he now sees people more through God's lens. And please note, he's not saying that when God accepts all people, God is content for them to stay where they are. Fearing God, giving generously, doing good, but being grossly ignorant of the final piece of the puzzle, which is Jesus. God's not happy with that. No, it's critical that Peter was organised to take the story of Jesus to Cornelius. If this Roman soldier's godly convictions was enough, why did he have to seek out the Jews? And if the synagogue had been enough for him, why did he have to seek out Peter? No, Peter has to instruct him now in the unique place of Jesus in God's great rescue plans. So you look from verse 36 onwards with me and you'll see the message that Peter preaches to these Gentiles. First time. Telling the good news of the peace through Jesus Christ. And note what he keeps saying in here. He says, who is Lord of all. And if you skip down to verse 38, he went around doing good and healing all. They killed him, God raised him. Verse 41, not seen by all, but by witnesses who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. Verse 42, Jesus commanded us to preach that he is the one God has appointed to judge all. Verse 43, all the Old Testament prophets point to him, that all who believe in him will receive forgiveness of sins. The heart of Christianity is not religious activities. It's not a moral code. It's not becoming middle class and having certain types of clothes. This is about believing in a person whom God has sent for everybody. Jesus is the Lord of all. He's the judge of all because he became putrid and unclean and unholy and cursed and hanged on a tree, ultimately so that we could be clean. If you're not sure what a Christian is here today, that's it in a nutshell. I'm sure you can come back at Easter and learn more about this. You can't write God off because he will not write you off. He is the Lord of all. He's the judge of all. If you're a Christian, then everyone must have the opportunity to hear about him because he came for all. We may write some people off. We may unconsciously have a bit of a selection process going on in our head. Peter says, I now realize that God does not play favourites. We think the gospel will only work on certain types of people, certain stratas of society, when need is triggered to a certain point in someone. But Peter says, it's for everyone. A while ago, I was singing in church, and I was up the back, and I got quite emotional. And I thought, what's going on here? And 2 seats in front of me, there was a man who years before had been brought to our church on Christmas Day. And he'd been living on the street. He was captive to his addiction, had been captive to his addictions, but now he had just become a Christian. And someone brought him along on Christmas Day and introduced him to me, who I was his potential pastor at that point. And I have to say my response to him was pretty cool. And the reason it was cool was because I thought, I wonder how long this will last. And then I also was very sort of protective of the many single female women in our congregation as well, and thought, I think he's going to go after them as well. But here I was watching a man in front of me, years on from that meeting, and he had a 6-year-old stepson that he was cuddling on one side of him, and then his wife, who up until the point of marrying him had been a single woman with a big load ahead of her in life. She loved Jesus, but it was pretty hard going as a single mum. And I was overwhelmed by 2 things. The amazing transformation before my eyes, and also the shame that I felt hesitating that first time I met him. So if God were to drop a sheep right now, what people would he put in it for you? Which people would be challenging for you? Maybe it's the strident advocate, the diversity advocate in your workplace. Maybe it's some foul-mouthed, sleazy party animal in your work crew. Maybe it's that grumpy old man on the Zimmer frame living next door to you with his ever-increasing list of complaints. Maybe it's that career-obsessed person who's shot past you and now appears to have it all. What prejudices do you harbour that prevent you from sharing the gospel and spreading it? Because the truth is, these people have no hope if the gospel doesn't get beyond Jerusalem, or if it doesn't get beyond these walls. But because of Acts 10, there is hope, isn't it? Just like there was for my brother singing 2 seats in front of me. Here at City Reach, you've got to have some blind spots. You have to. You're human. Take a walk through the suburbs around here. Just look at who's there. Look at who's in your workplace with you. The parents who are picking up their kids at the same school where your kids go. Just take a good look at people with whom you end up sharing space. Are you prepared to move into potentially uncomfortable territory? Don't deny the power of the gospel. Paul says in Ephesians 2 that the dividing wall of hostility between the Jews and the Gentiles has been torn down. It's decimated. There is no barrier anymore because of Jesus. So what people are absent from your prayer life? What people never make it to your dinner table? What people in your busy calendar never find a spot? What people are missing in this community here? Who's in your sheet? Be honest with yourself. None of us have an empty sheet. We have our own prejudices. They lead us to write some people off as too hard, too far gone, not worth it, not clean enough. But it's no accident where you live. It's no accident where you work. Messenger and hearer are constantly colliding for divine appointments. And this is how it's going to happen till Jesus returns. That's how the gospel gets to the end of the earth. Not always by angels, not always by visions. Which people are in your sheet? I'm really challenging you this week to think about this. Go and reread Acts 10. God says, verse 15, don't call anything impure that I have made clean. So I'm going to suggest what we do to finish is we stand and we actually say these words of Peter for ourselves. And don't say them unless you really mean it. But if you'd like to stand with me now. We say together, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts people from every nation who fear him and do what is right. Just stay standing and I'll pray. Jesus, Lord of all, who healed all, died for all, rose for all, will judge all, transform our view of humanity. Please, root out our blind prejudices. Give us humility to accept all people so that nothing prevents the spread of your good news. Through our lives, through our church, throughout this city and our world. Amen.